Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable duels and questionable survival instincts of some of the most absurdly intense one-on-one fights in medieval history. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you've ever waited 6 months for a reply from customer service, imagine waiting 2 years for a king to approve your duel-to-the-death request. Welcome to France in the 1380s, where justice moved slowly but involved significantly more stabbing. Jean de Carouge was your classic medieval knight, proud, angry, and just a bit obsessed with inheritance disputes. His wife, Marguerite, accused another knight, Jacques Legris, of raping her while Jean was off doing knight things, which mostly involved either riding in circles or suing his neighbours. Carouges naturally believed her. Legris naturally denied everything. Since medieval courts were about as reliable as a weather forecast from a goat, the judges threw up their hands and said, "Let God decide," by which they meant, let the two men put on full armour, charge each other with lances, and see who dies first. The duel took place in December 1386, in front of King Charles VI, Queen Isabeau, and a crowd of thousands who showed up to watch justice be served like it was WrestleMania. Oh, and Marguerite? She sat in the stands on a wooden scaffold, tied to a chair. If her husband lost, she'd be burned alive for false accusation, no pressure. The fight was brutal. They started with lances, both shattered, then swords, then axes. At one point, Carouges was knocked to the ground, but managed to rally, tackle Legris, and drive a dagger through his neck while yelling something appropriately dramatic. Crowd went wild. Justice was served, Marguerite got to live, and France collectively decided, you know what? Maybe we should stop doing this. It was the last sanctioned trial by combat in France, which is a shame, really, because it had excellent spectator value and far fewer commercials than modern legal dramas. As for Carouges, he became a national celebrity. As for Legris, he remained very, very dead, although centuries later, some historians would suggest he might have been innocent. Which just goes to show, in medieval France, truth was a distant second to theatrics, and God had a strangely high tolerance for judicial bloodsport. Moral of the story: if you're ever in legal trouble, maybe don't ask the king for sword-based arbitration. Unless you're really good with a dagger. Godfrey of Bouillon was the kind of man who heard the phrase, "take up the cross," and decided it meant also taking up a very large sword and developing a personal rivalry with gravity. As one of the leading commanders of the First Crusade, Godfrey was famously devout, deeply committed to reclaiming Jerusalem, and, crucially, built like a siege tower. He didn't just fight for Christendom, he bodied for it. But even in a war full of religious zealots and overcooked chainmail, one fight stood out: Godfrey versus the giant Saracen. The tale is part history, part testosterone-soaked legend. While marching through the Levant, Godfrey reportedly found himself face-to-face with a towering Muslim warrior, a local champion sent to intimidate the Frankish invaders. The man was said to be over 7 feet tall and armoured like a walking fortress. Naturally, the two agreed to settle the matter of whose god is better, with good old-fashioned ultra-violence. No armies, no strategies. Just 2 men, 1 sword each, and a mutual lack of concern for their kneecaps. According to the chroniclers, whose accuracy is debatable but whose flair for drama is not, the duel was brutal and short. Godfrey charged, took a heavy blow that would have turned a lesser knight into a pancake, and then, in true Crusader fashion, responded by slicing the giant clean in half vertically. Yes, vertically, like a medieval fruit ninja. Now, whether this is anatomically or physically possible depends on your opinion of physics and how bored medieval monks were when writing battle reports. Either way, the story spread like wildfire. God had apparently picked his favourite again. This duel cemented Godfrey's reputation as the holy heavyweight of the Crusades. He went on to become defender of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, refusing the title of king because he didn't want to wear a crown where Christ wore thorns. But he was perfectly fine cleaving opponents in half like firewood, which really tells you everything about medieval piety. Moral of the story? In the Middle Ages, religious diplomacy often involved fewer sermons and more sword-based interpretive dance. And if you're ever challenged by someone described as a giant, maybe check if your opponent has a biblical nickname before accepting. Richard the Lionheart wasn't known for his subtlety. He was known for storming castles, composing war poetry, seriously, and killing people with a kind of cheerful efficiency that made even other crusaders slightly uncomfortable. But among his many dramatic moments during the Third Crusade, one particularly theatrical 1 versus 1 stands out: his duel with Saladin's champion. Now, a few disclaimers. First, this wasn't a barroom brawl between Richard and Saladin themselves, which is a pity, because that would have broken YouTube in the year 1191. Instead, this was a high-profile bout arranged between Richard and one of Saladin's finest warriors. Name lost to history, unfortunately, but let's just call him the guy who had a very bad day. The duel was part of a medieval tradition where opposing commanders occasionally agreed to a champion fight. Not to end the war, of course. Don't be silly. This was more of a flex, a medieval talent show with fewer violins and more bladed weapons. So the Saracen warrior rode out, armoured and gleaming, ready to impress his sultan and god alike. Richard, of course, showed up like it was opening night at the Crusader Theatre, mounted, resplendent in chainmail, sword practically humming with righteous arrogance. They circled, they clashed, and in mere moments, Richard reportedly sliced clean through the man's shield and armour, nearly down to the saddle. Eyewitnesses gasped. The Saracens blinked. And Richard, just to be extra dramatic, then chopped through an iron bar with the same sword to prove it wasn't a fluke. Because, apparently, 1 kill wasn't enough. The sword needed a solo. Saladin, watching from afar, was said to be impressed, in that quiet, note to self, don't duel this man, sort of way. He even responded with his own bit of flair days later, sending Richard Snow from Mount Lebanon to cool his fever. War was war, but a little passive-aggressive hospitality never hurt. Did this fight change the outcome of the crusade? Absolutely not. Did it give Richard's legend a boost? Without question. And in a time when battlefield selfies weren't an option, this was the next best thing. Sometimes history doesn't give us a grand duel with speeches, orchestras, or dragons. Sometimes it just gives us a Scottish king who's mildly annoyed and a knight who made one very poor decision. It was June 23rd, 1314, the day before the Battle of Bannockburn, the medieval equivalent of the Super Bowl, but with more mud and fewer commercials. Robert the Bruce, King of Scots and part-time survivalist, was out scouting the battlefield on a small horse, not a war horse, mind you, but the medieval version of a compact sedan, just trotting around, minding his own rebellion. Enter Henry de Bohun, an English knight and proud owner of an ego the size of Westminster Abbey. From across the field, he spotted Bruce, alone, unarmoured, and apparently not interested in being dramatically murdered. To Henry, this looked like divine opportunity, a chance to single-handedly end the Scottish rebellion and look amazing doing it. So Henry did what any overconfident aristocrat would do. He lowered his lance and charged full speed at a king. No backup, no second opinion, just vibes. Robert the Bruce saw this happening and, according to every source, did not panic. He didn't call for help. He didn't even dismount. He simply waited. Calmly. Probably a bit insulted. At the last possible moment, Bruce stood in the stirrups, guided his smaller horse slightly to the side, and obliterated Henry de Bohun's skull with a single axe swing. 1 hit. Instant correction. The kind of head trauma that ends both a duel and your entire genealogical line. The axe split not just Henry's helmet, but also the handle, which annoyed Bruce more than the whole nearly being killed thing. Later, When his men congratulated him on the epic kill, Bruce reportedly grumbled about breaking his favourite weapon. Priorities. This wasn't just a flashy moment. It demoralised the English, emboldened the Scots, and gave Robert the Bruce the kind of campaign poster no modern politician could dream of. Vote for Bruce. He's not dead yet. The Middle Ages were, among other things, a period in which legal systems occasionally said, "You know what? Let's just fight about it." Hence the concept of the judicial duel, where two parties settled serious accusations, not with lawyers, but with maces. And in 13th to 15th century Germany, this glorious logic reached its peak with the husband versus wife pit duel. Yes, a man and woman, fighting, in a hole. Here's how it worked. If a wife accused her husband of serious misconduct, or vice versa, and both parties insisted on a trial by combat, a special duel was arranged. But not on equal terms, of course. That would be too modern. Instead, the man was placed inside a shallow pit, armed with nothing but a club. The woman stood outside the pit, wielding a rock tied up in a sling, essentially a medieval flail. Both combatants wore tight-fitting linen suits, because clearly dignity had already left the chat. To keep things fair, and by fair we mean deeply confusing, the man's mobility was limited by the pit, while the woman had to keep one foot in a special cloth sack at all times, so she couldn't just run circles around him. Which meant the entire duel looked like a drunken interpretation of modern dance, but with significantly higher stakes. Historical records show these duels were not just theatrical. They were lethal. In one famous case from 1200s Germany, a woman beat her husband to death in the pit, flailing him with her weighted sling until he gave up both the fight and his right to ever again speak during dinner. And yes, it was all perfectly legal. The winner was considered justified in their claim. No cross-examinations, no appeals, just two people solving their marital dispute in front of an audience of neighbours, monks, and that one guy who brought popcorn before popcorn existed. The pit duel became such a cultural fixture that illustrated manuscripts from the era show diagrams of the proper stances, because nothing says civilization like instructions for bashing your spouse with a rock. Not all duels happen in quiet courtyards or muddy pits. Some take place in the middle of a battle, when thousands of people are screaming, swords are everywhere, and the air smells like sweat, horsehair, and poor decision-making. Such was the case in 1265, when Guy de Montfort, son of the rebel Simon de Montfort, found himself facing off against none other than Prince Edward, the future Edward I of England. Now, this wasn't a formal one-versus-one duel, with referees and honour codes. It was the Battle of Evesham, one of the nastiest family fallouts in English history. Guy's father, Simon de Montfort, had led a rebellion against King Henry III, who just happened to be Edward's dad. So when the two sides clashed, it was less polite disagreement and more, let's murder each other in front of God and everyone. In the middle of the chaos, Guy de Montfort spotted Prince Edward. For a brief, glorious moment, it was personal. Rebel son versus royal heir, a clash worthy of a bard's song. Guy charged. Edward met him. Swords rang out. Chroniclers claim the two traded blows in a heated exchange, steel against steel, adrenaline versus royal entitlement. The problem for Guy? Edward wasn't just good at swordplay. He was also surrounded by friends, heavily armed, not particularly patient friends. Before long, Guy found himself outnumbered, overpowered, and quickly realising that duelling a prince during a pitched battle is like challenging a mafia boss in his own restaurant. Brave, but terminally stupid. Edward survived, obviously. He went on to become the rather terrifying Edward Longshanks, conqueror of Wales and hammer of the Scots. Guy, on the other hand, survived that day, but not his reputation. His family was crushed, his cause obliterated, and the duel that might have been legendary turned into a historical footnote. He tried, which, in fairness, is more than most rebels could say. It wasn't the kind of one-versus-one duel to inspire chivalric romances. It was messy, brief, and completely overshadowed by the slaughter around it. But still, for a few minutes, one man really did try to take down a future king with nothing but courage and a sharp blade. Nothing says refined medieval justice quite like throwing a man in armour into a pit with a bear. This wasn't a metaphorical bear. This was a real claws and teeth hulking Russian beast. And yes, the knight was expected to fight it. The tradition? If one were accused of a serious crime in certain parts of medieval Eastern Europe, murder, treason, or saying something rude about the local Tsar's beard, one potential punishment was being tossed into a duel with a bear. The bear, not being a lawyer, was not particularly interested in evidence. The knight, meanwhile, was expected to prove his innocence by winning. There were no referees, just fate, fur, and flailing limbs. One of the most infamous cases comes from late medieval Russia, though unfortunately, or mercifully, most details have blurred into legend. A disgraced knight, stripped of land and honour, was accused of a capital offence. He invoked his right to a trial by ordeal, and the state, always eager for low-budget entertainment, agreed. So they chained a bear in a wooden arena, gave the knight a sword, not a particularly sharp one, according to rumour, and opened the gate. The crowd, naturally, was thrilled. Who needed Netflix when you had potential evisceration live at noon? The knight, to his credit, did not die in the first 30 seconds, which already puts him ahead of most people who've tried to duel apex predators. He reportedly dodged, slashed, and at one point may have even stabbed the bear in the thigh. The bear, unimpressed, returned the favour by nearly decapitating him with a swipe. Somewhere in the chaos, both fell, the crowd screamed, and the Tsar's officials stepped in, possibly because the bear had become too enthusiastic. The verdict? Technically inconclusive. The knight lived. The bear also lived. But the knight was later exiled, suggesting that, in the great duel of man versus nature, the judicial system chose fur over chainmail. This wasn't justice. This was performance art with a high casualty rate. But for a time it was considered legitimate, as long as you weren't the one holding the sword. Some knights duel other warriors, others challenge fearsome beasts. And then there's Ulrich von Liechtenstein, who decided the most worthy opponent was himself. Let's clarify. Ulrich didn't literally punch his own reflection in a Gothic mirror. Instead, this 13th century Austrian nobleman composed a chivalric autobiography titled Frauendienst, Service of Ladies, that reads like the fever dream of someone who drank too much mead and too little water. In it, he recounts travelling across Europe dressed as Venus, the Roman goddess of love. Yes, a full-grown man in medieval drag, riding from tournament to tournament, proclaiming his undying love for a mysterious noblewoman who, as far as historians can tell, never actually asked for this. Ulrich, in all seriousness, wore a golden dress, a long blonde wig, and led an entourage of minstrels, while declaring himself the literal embodiment of divine femininity. Naturally, when people laughed, he challenged them to duels, and, allegedly, won every single one. In his own words, because nobody else was volunteering to write this, Ulrich defeated over 300 knights in single combat, while dressed as Venus. It was, apparently, his way of proving love's power. Most modern people just send flowers. The line between fact and flamboyant fan fiction gets increasingly blurry as his memoir continues. At one point, Ulrich claims he cut off his own finger, put it in a gold box, and mailed it to his lady as a love token. She responded, presumably, with a restraining order written in calligraphy. To be clear, Frauendienst is not considered a reliable historical source. It is, however, one of the earliest autobiographies in German literature, which means medieval Europe's answer to a memoir was one man inventing an entire saga of self-imposed quests, self-inflicted pain, and self-declared victories, all to impress a woman who was either imaginary or deeply annoyed. Was this a duel in the strictest sense? Maybe not, but in terms of a psychological 1v1 match between chivalric ideals and common sense, Ulrich absolutely went 12 rounds with his own ego and came out swinging. The Middle Ages gave us many bold warriors, but few had the audacity, or perhaps the sheer unhinged confidence, of Zawisza the Bear. No, that's not a typo. Not Zawisza the Black, the famous nobleman and symbol of Polish chivalry. This was another Zawisza, possibly a local noble, mercenary, or just a guy who took things way too literally. The legend goes that sometime in the 14th century during a tournament or a personal duel, accounts differ, but let's face it, historical accuracy went out the window the moment someone unsheathed their birthday suit. A Polish knight showed up to a fight entirely nude. Why? Allegedly to prove that armour, titles and flashy heraldry meant nothing. Just guts, skill, and a complete disregard for temperature or decency laws. The crowd was confused. His opponent was, understandably, hesitant. The referee, if there was one, probably pretended to lose his voice. And yet, according to those same questionable but delightful sources, the naked knight won. Yes, he fought fully exposed, blades clashing, limbs dodging, all while his most vulnerable assets were swinging in the medieval breeze. His opponent, wearing full armour and presumably a sense of dignity, was either too stunned or too distracted to land a killing blow. There's a theory that the nudity was symbolic, a way to demonstrate purity of combat. "Behold," he might have declared, "I have nothing to hide." Of course, he could have just been drunk, or trying to make a point about fashion, or both. The Polish chronicles don't give us his real name, maybe they were too embarrassed, but his legend lingers, whispered among historians like a cautionary tale. He is the cautionary tale, about ego, daring, and the hazards of going into battle without pants. Was it practical? No. Was it hygienic? Doubtful. Did he win? Apparently. Which makes him arguably more successful than most fully clothed knights with entire coats of arms behind them. Moral of the story? In medieval Europe, anything was possible, especially if you didn't mind chafing. If you ever travel back in time and end up in a duel, remember, skill matters. But a completely unhinged first impression might win the psychological war before swords even cross. Before medieval tournaments were sanitized into jousts with polite clapping and overpriced turkey legs, they were glorious, chaotic bloodbaths called melees. And no one thrived in the swirling mess of clanging steel, crushed egos and unregulated violence quite like William Marshall. Born around 1146, William was the son of a minor noble, and, like any second son with no inheritance and lots of biceps, he turned to knighthood. But not the courtly, flower-sniffing kind. William went full berserker, earning fame in melee tournaments, which at the time were basically large-scale 1v1s, with dozens of participants, no teams, and the goal of either capturing your opponent or beating them until they gave you money to stop. Marshall's tactic? Charge into the chaos like a human battering ram. If elegance was a sword stroke, he missed it entirely. But his record? Ridiculous. In one season, he reportedly unhorsed 500 knights. That's not a duel. That's a medieval hitman resume. He became so terrifying that nobles would literally try to avoid being in the same melee as him. "Ah, William's here. Sorry, I suddenly remembered I left my chainmail in the bath." His horse was trampled so often, tournament officials had to start giving him replacement horses as prizes. At some point, he stopped counting. And the man was chivalrous too, at least by medieval standards. Once, he knocked a guy off his horse, helped him up, then robbed him anyway. Chivalry. Eventually, William's melee rampage made him rich and respected. He rose through the ranks, became an advisor to kings, and served 5 English monarchs without being murdered even once, which, given the Plantagenet track record, is its own miracle. In old age, well into his 70s, he was still strapping on armour and leading troops. At the Battle of Lincoln in 1217, he personally charged into enemy lines, like he was still 30, and came out without a scratch, which means either he was divinely protected, or everyone else was too scared to hit him. When he finally died, they buried him at the Temple Church in London, where his tomb still quietly flexes to this day. Monks, peaceful, devout, bald, known for making beer and illuminating manuscripts. But occasionally, in the grand tradition of passive-aggressively smiting one another in the name of Christ, they got just a little bit stabby. Let's travel to the wild ecclesiastical frontier of 11th century France, where a bizarre footnote in monastic history occurred, a trial by combat between two monks. Yes, actual monks. Not knights who retired into prayer robes, actual monks who normally wouldn't hurt a fly unless it buzzed during Vespers. The source, as foggy as a medieval morning, mentions a legal dispute between two Benedictine brothers, possibly over land, heresy, or who got to sing lead during matins. In the absence of an agreeable bishop, the matter was escalated to a sword fight, because nothing says turn the other cheek like pulling out a broadsword and swinging for the tonsure. Eyewitnesses claim the duel was conducted according to the sacred rites of both canon law and general lunacy. One monk, let's call him Brother Odo, was reportedly small, wiry and quick on his feet. The other, Brother Hugo, was more rotund and chose the intimidating tactic of glowering with righteous indignation. Both were robed. Neither, it seems, had combat training beyond possibly fighting over soup ladles in the cloister kitchen. They met in a courtyard with a few unfortunate pigeons watching from the rafters. Blows were exchanged. Sandals were lost. Habits were torn. One monk landed a hit with what was either a blessed staff or just a glorified walking stick. The other responded by tackling him into a trough. Eventually, one monk emerged victorious, barely breathing and covered in both bruises and theological shame. Justice, apparently, had been served. This event was so profoundly ridiculous that the church immediately cracked down on it. Trial by combat was already controversial, but monk-on-monk dueling was a bridge too far. Canon law was tightened. Future monk fights were relegated to stern glances and side-eyes over dinner. You know a civilization has really committed to the chaos of medieval justice when two grown men in armour decide to settle a cheese-related dispute with a duel. Welcome to 12th century Denmark, where the dairy flowed like wine and tempers were only slightly cooler than curdling milk. The details come to us from a local chronicle now mostly lost to time, and probably mice. But the tale is simple. Two Danish nobles, let's call them Lord Knud and Sir Sven, could not agree on who owned a particularly fertile pasture or the cheese produced therein. Yes, cheese. Not land. Not honour. Cheese. In theory, they could have mediated the dispute over a flagon of mead like reasonable men. But this was medieval Denmark, where arbitration often involved swords, yelling, and a very poor understanding of consequences. Witnesses say the duel was arranged in a clearing just outside Roskilde. The weapons were broadswords, the stakes, ownership of a small herd of goats, several wheels of soft heavenly cheese, and, crucially, the right to be the man who won a duel over cheese for the rest of his life. Lord Knud was a large, sweaty noble with the upper body of a Viking and the footwork of a sack of barley. Sir Sven, smaller and wirier, was a known cheese enthusiast, which some say gave him the psychological edge, or perhaps he was just angry someone had touched his brie. The duel lasted longer than expected. Both men shouted accusations about curd theft and lactose-related heresy. At one point, Knud slipped on a wheel of cheese, because yes, someone brought them to the field for dramatic flair and nearly impaled himself on his own sword. In the end, Sven managed to land a clumsy but decisive blow to Knud's leg, sending him sprawling. He demanded satisfaction and the cheese, which he received, along with mild fame in local ballads that rhyme bravery with dairy. The church, predictably horrified, tried to outlaw such nonsense shortly after, but the damage had been done. Cheese duelling entered Danish legend. Of all the weapons forged in medieval Europe, few were as underappreciated as the humble frying pan. Designed for eggs, not executions, it rarely made it onto the battlefield, except once, in the case of one supremely annoyed French knight who turned cookware into carnage. The tale comes from a 13th century tavern account, hardly official, but delightfully absurd. Our hero, Sir Guillaume du Fer, was not your typical paragon of chivalry. He was a minor knight, land poor, debt rich, and extremely passionate about two things: his honour and his breakfast. One morning, while visiting a roadside inn near Toulouse, Sir Guillaume found himself in a heated argument with another knight, a smug noble named Raoul de Charente, who allegedly insulted his cooking and implied his bacon was unworthy of nobility. This was not just culinary criticism, it was social annihilation. A duel was demanded. Now this wasn't a battlefield or a tournament, it was a tavern kitchen, and Sir Guillaume didn't have his sword. But he did have a cast-iron skillet, still sizzling with the righteous fury of eggs recently cooked. Raoul, meanwhile, had a dagger and zero sense of humour. Eyewitnesses claim the fight was short, but spectacular. Sir Guillaume swung the pan like a flanged mace, knocking over chairs, splattering grease, and delivering a clanging uppercut that reportedly rang like a cathedral bell. Raoul attempted a parry and got slapped across the helm by half an omelette. The duel ended with Raoul unconscious in a pile of ash and onions. Guillaume declared victory, flipped the pan in triumph, and finished cooking his breakfast. Some say the innkeeper gave him free meals for life. Others say the church issued a quiet reprimand for turning kitchens into arenas of judgment. Regardless, the frying pan duel of Toulouse became legend. Knights retold it for years, usually after a few drinks and with exaggerated choreography involving bacon shields and egg-based parries. Not all medieval duels ended in a spray of arterial drama and victorious monologues. Some, bafflingly, ended in emotions, unplanned ones. Case in point, the bizarre and vaguely heartwarming 14th century duel between two knights who began as bitter enemies and ended, well, sort of cuddling. The story takes place during the 100 Years' War, which, contrary to its name, was less a continuous war and more of a long, toxic on-again, off-again relationship between England and France. Amidst this emotional battlefield, two knights, Sir Thomas de Scales of England and Jean le Boutellier of Brittany, found themselves caught in a heated argument over prisoner exchanges, ransom etiquette, and whose mother wore more armour. A duel was arranged, because, again, talking things out hadn't been invented yet. Witnesses say the knights clashed with gusto. There were lances, swords, and just enough chivalric flair to make the French poets swoon. But after several minutes of sweaty grappling, each man realised something crucial. They were completely exhausted, and probably too evenly matched to kill each other without risking cardiac arrest. Then came the moment. Locked in a clench, panting through their helmets like wheezing goats, one of them, possibly Jean, reportedly muttered something like, "Are we done?" Sir Thomas, never one for poetry, allegedly grunted, "Only if you are." And that was it. They backed off, both bleeding slightly, both looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. A truce was declared. Some accounts even say they shook hands. One source, likely exaggerated by a minstrel on mushrooms, insists they embraced, removed their helmets, and laughed about the futility of war while the crowd awkwardly applauded. Naturally, neither man ever fully admitted to the hug, but it stuck in the bardic record as one of the strangest conclusions to a duel ever. The church approved. So did their squires, who no longer had to clean entrails off chainmail. Long before Spain was a single country, it was a very crowded peninsula where Christian kings, Moorish emirs, and everyone's third cousin were constantly battling for castles, goats, and the honour of obscure saints. Out of this fiery stew rose Rodrigo Diaz de Viva, better known as El Cid, part warlord, part poet, part national branding opportunity. But long before he became the heroic exile of every Spanish high school textbook, young Rodrigo was already making a name for himself by punching above his social weight, literally. The tale goes that in the 11th century he got into a nasty feud with Count Garcia Ordóñez, a man who, by all accounts, had a face that practically invited duelling. The conflict was supposedly over politics, honour, and possibly a disputed sheep tax. Details remain fuzzy, but historians agree the two men ended up in a trial by combat, a medieval HR-approved method of saying, "Let's just fight about it." The duel took place in front of King Ferdinand of Leon and Castile, which added a certain "don't embarrass yourself in front of the boss" pressure. Garcia came armoured like a walking ironclad, confident in his noble lineage and perhaps too many meads. Rodrigo, by contrast, was younger, leaner, and filled with the burning energy of a man who'd spent his 20s being called Rodrigo from that place you've never heard of. The fight didn't last long. According to legend, Rodrigo struck Garcia so hard that the Count fell off his horse and tasted Castilian dirt. It wasn't just a physical defeat, it was a social demotion, a televised flop before television was invented. Rodrigo, victorious, was now standard-bearer of Castile, which is the medieval equivalent of being promoted directly from mailroom to CEO via public brawl. As for Garcia, he likely sulked off to a monastery to reconsider his life choices, or possibly become a professional guy who gets beaten by El Cid in local ballads. In Elizabethan England, fashion was far more than a matter of beauty or taste. It was the visual language of power, politics and class. Every ruffle, pearl and thread spoke volumes about where one stood in society, and stepping outside your prescribed rank could be dangerous. At a glance, a gown could tell you everything you needed to know. Not just the wealth of its wearer, but their political allegiance, their ambitions, and even their loyalty to the crown. The Elizabethan world was tightly regulated by sumptuary laws, acts of parliament that dictated what fabrics and colours different classes could wear. These laws were not just about vanity, but control. They preserved the rigid hierarchy of Tudor England, ensuring that no ambitious merchant or minor noble could dress like an earl without drawing suspicion or punishment. Purple silks, for example, were off-limits to almost everyone. That shade was so expensive and so deeply tied to imperial dignity that only the Queen herself had the right to flaunt it. Cloth of gold and silver-threaded velvets were likewise restricted to the upper nobility. If you were a tradesman with new money and tried to pass yourself off as a gentleman by wearing satin doublets or an embroidered cloak, you risked fines, the confiscation of your clothing, and the mockery of your neighbours. These punishments weren't merely symbolic. They kept the entire social order intact by reminding everyone that fashion was not a personal choice, but a political statement enforced by law. For the court, dress was even more performative. Queen Elizabeth I understood the power of spectacle better than anyone. She turned her body into a walking tapestry of propaganda. Portraits show her covered in pearls, the gemstone associated with chastity and purity, making her the Virgin Queen in visual form. The sheer scale of her ruffs, some wide enough to frame her face like a halo, was a deliberate statement. The Queen was untouchable, radiant, set apart from ordinary mortals. Her courtiers followed suit, competing in a lavish arms race of silks, jewels and embroidery to curry favour and display loyalty. Thus, Elizabethan fashion was not mere decoration. It was a battlefield stitched in silk. To wear the wrong fabric was to risk your reputation, your fortune, and even the wrath of the Queen. Clothing became politics woven into every seam, a constant reminder that in Tudor England, you were what you wore. If one fashion item captures the excess and spectacle of Elizabethan dress, it is the ruff. What began as a modest pleated collar in the early 1500s quickly spiraled into a fashion phenomenon, growing wider, stiffer, and more elaborate with each passing decade. By the height of Elizabeth's reign, ruffs could reach a span so large that the wearer's head seemed to hover on a floating platter. They were impractical, ridiculous even, but that was the point. Only those with immense wealth and leisure could afford to wear something so ostentatious, something that made eating, turning your head, or even breathing freely nearly impossible. The ruff was not just a collar, it was a statement. Constructed from fine linen or lace, and stiffened with starch imported from the Low Countries, it required hours of careful ironing, pinning, and arranging. Servants dedicated entire mornings to shaping the folds into crisp perfection. The largest ruffs, sometimes called cartwheel ruffs, could be supported with wire frames known as support asses, essentially little cages strapped around the neck. A misstep at a banquet could leave your elaborate lace collar sagging, an embarrassment that no courtier could afford. Like fabrics, ruffs were regulated by class. The finest lace versions were reserved for the elite, while lower ranks had to make do with smaller, simpler versions. Queen Elizabeth herself weaponized the ruff in her portraits, often appearing with collars so immense that her face seemed framed like the rising sun. This visual dominance was deliberate. Her courtiers, in turn, engaged in a competitive display of ruff size and decoration, each attempting to outdo the other without overstepping the Queen's precedence. Ruffs also carried a hidden symbolism. Their perfect circles, radiating from the wearer's neck, evoked halos, making nobles appear saintly or divine. Elizabeth, who mastered the art of turning fashion into political theatre, understood this better than anyone. The Virgin Queen was not merely dressed, she was sanctified, her authority reinforced by lace, starch and spectacle. To wear a ruff was to advertise your refinement, your resources, and your place within the great hierarchy of Tudor England. To maintain it required patience, servants, and money, luxuries that separated the nobility from the masses. The ruff, then, was the Elizabethan world in miniature, beautiful, fragile, costly, and designed to keep everyone in their proper place. Behind the dazzling fabrics and towering ruffs lay the foundation of Elizabethan style, the corset. Known at the time as stays or bodies, these stiffened garments quite literally shaped the ideal Elizabethan figure. Forget soft curves. What the court demanded was a rigid geometric silhouette. The fashionable body was triangular, broad shoulders tapering down into a narrow waist, with the torso pressed flat like a board. This shape was not natural, but that was the point. Clothing in Elizabeth's court was about control, artifice, and the triumph of social order over the chaos of nature. Corsets were usually constructed from layers of linen reinforced with whalebone, horn, or even iron strips. They flattened the bust, straightened the posture, and pushed the body into a stiff cone. For noble women, the corset was essential, for it transformed the wearer into a walking symbol of discipline and status. Servants laced them tightly in the morning, and once inside, movement was restricted. Breathing deeply became difficult, bending forward awkward. Yet this discomfort was precisely what marked elite women apart from the lower classes. Labourers could not afford such impracticality. Their bodies had to remain free for work. At court, however, the inability to bend or breathe freely was itself a mark of privilege. But corsets were only part of the engineering. Beneath their gowns, women wore farthingales, cone-shaped hoops, often made of whalebone, that extended skirts outward in massive circles. Introduced from Spain, the farthingale gave Elizabethan dresses their iconic bell-like shape, transforming women into grand architectural structures. Together with corsets, they created a body that was less flesh and blood than sculpted spectacle. Queen Elizabeth set the ultimate standard. Portraits show her waist tightly cinched, her skirts flaring outward, her torso rigid as marble. The Virgin Queen appeared untouchable, less a woman than an icon draped in power. Courtiers imitated her silhouette obsessively, competing to display the most extreme shapes. Every fold and angle of fabric declared loyalty, discipline, and control. Qualities prized in a court obsessed with hierarchy. Thus, in the Elizabethan world, the body itself became political real estate. Fashion reshaped flesh into an emblem of obedience, wealth, and refinement. To lace yourself into a corset was to submit not only to beauty, but to the unyielding order of Elizabeth's England. If corsets and farthingales gave Elizabethan fashion its architectural structure, then pearls and embroidery provided its language. To step into court was to enter a hall of shimmering surfaces. Gowns glittered with gold thread, doublets sparkled with jewels, and nearly every noble seemed stitched into a tapestry of wealth. But these weren't mere decorations. They were symbols carefully chosen to broadcast meaning, rank, and allegiance. Pearls held a special place in Elizabethan culture. They were the jewels of the sea, expensive to import and time-consuming to harvest. To wear pearls was to flaunt one's ability to buy rarity itself. Queen Elizabeth made pearls her personal emblem. She wore them by the hundreds, strung in ropes around her neck, sewn into her gowns, dangling from her hair, and even embroidered into her shoes. Their milky sheen symbolized purity, reinforcing her cultivated image as the Virgin Queen. Portraits show her almost drowning in pearls, as if purity itself had taken physical form and clothed her body. For her courtiers, wearing pearls was not just fashion but political theatre. To echo the Queen's jewel of choice was to echo her virtue. Embroidery served a similar function, but with even more versatility. A gown might feature stitched roses to honour the Tudor dynasty, pomegranates for fertility, or suns and moons to symbolise constancy. Skilled artisans spent months turning garments into coded texts of loyalty and ambition. Wealthy families hired entire teams of embroiderers to adorn sleeves and bodices with metallic thread, creating wearable propaganda. To walk into court with a gown glittering in gold was not merely to appear fashionable, it was to declare power stitched into every seam. The cost was staggering. A heavily embroidered gown could equal the price of a London townhouse. Pearls alone were worth fortunes, and their weight on a dress made even standing upright a challenge. But Elizabethan courtiers endured the discomfort gladly. Every glittering stitch was a declaration. I belong here, among the powerful. In this way, Elizabethan fashion was never silent. It spoke through gems, thread, and shimmer. It told stories of chastity, loyalty, and ambition. To dress richly was to write yourself into the Queen's theatre of power, a stage where clothing was not vanity, but a weapon. When we picture Elizabethan fashion, it is easy to imagine only the towering gowns and pearl-encrusted collars of the Queen's ladies. Yet men at court were no less flamboyant in their pursuit of style. In fact, Elizabethan men turned dressing into an art of dominance, using doublets, hose, and slashed sleeves to broadcast power, virility, and allegiance to the crown. The male silhouette of the time was padded and exaggerated. The centerpiece was the doublet, a snug, tailored jacket that extended down to the waist, stiffened with padding to project a broad chest and narrow torso. Underneath, men wore shirts with embroidered collars that peaked above the doublet's neckline, often finished with a small ruff. Some courtiers even stuffed their doublets with bombast, a kind of wadding, to give the illusion of muscular strength. Looking strong was just as important as being strong, and in the politics of the Elizabethan court, image was everything. Breeches, or hose, completed the look. Early in the reign they were tight-fitting, but as the decades passed, they ballooned outward into trunk hose, short padded shorts that puffed extravagantly around the hips. To modern eyes they look almost comical, but at the time they symbolized masculine confidence and aristocratic leisure. These were clothes that made riding, dueling, or dancing look heroic, and they required constant tailoring to maintain their puffed perfection. Then there were the sleeves. Elizabethan men adored slashed and paned sleeves, where outer fabric was cut to reveal the fine silk or satin beneath. This layering was a deliberate show of wealth. Why own one luxurious fabric when you could show off two at once? Bright colours, scarlet, saffron, and deep blue, further heightened the spectacle, while jewels and gold embroidery elevated noblemen above the rest. Accessories were equally important. Men wore jewelled hats with tall feathers, carried ornate swords with gilded hilts, and adorned themselves with rings and chains heavy enough to dent a table. These were not frivolities, but markers of allegiance. To glitter at court was to show you had the Queen's favour, or at least the resources to pretend. Elizabethan men, like their female counterparts, were trapped in a theatre of appearances. Every puffed sleeve and padded chest was a performance, each detail a declaration of loyalty, wealth, and masculinity. The men of Elizabeth's court dressed not just to impress, but to survive in a world where power was stitched, padded, and slashed into silk. If the gown or doublet was the body of Elizabethan fashion, then shoes, accessories, and cosmetics were the finishing touches that transformed courtiers into living works of art. In a world where appearances were political statements, no detail was too small to overlook. The flick of a feather in a cap, or the tint of a cheek, could signal loyalty, wealth, or scandal. Shoes in Elizabethan England were often surprisingly simple in shape, but no less extravagant in material. Men favoured square-toed slippers made from velvet or leather, sometimes decorated with rosettes or embroidery. Women's shoes were similarly low-heeled, designed more for show than for practicality. Since skirts often brushed the ground, ladies' footwear rarely had the chance to dazzle, but fine materials and hidden embroidery marked status even where few could see it. For both sexes, shoes symbolised refinement. Practical boots were for the working classes. Accessories, however, were where the real competition began. Hats were essential, especially for men. Courtiers strutted through the palace in felt caps or tall crowns, adorned with feathers imported from exotic lands. A single plume from an ostrich or peacock was more than decoration. It was a signal of wealth and connections abroad. Chains of office made of gold and hung heavy around the neck carried political meaning. They marked rank and the Queen's favour. Even gloves, often perfumed and embroidered, became fashionable tokens exchanged as gifts to secure alliances or flirtations. Cosmetics were equally charged with meaning. Women, and occasionally men, painted their faces with a stark white foundation made of ceruse, a mixture of vinegar and white lead. It created the desired pale complexion that spoke of aristocratic leisure, far removed from the sunburnt skin of peasants. Rouge tinted the cheeks, while vermilion brightened the lips. Some even darkened their eyebrows with soot or coal dust, framing the face like a living portrait. Of course, these concoctions were often poisonous, slowly damaging the skin, but vanity outweighed health in the theatre of Elizabethan fashion. Perfume completed the ensemble. Imported from Italy or France, it masked the odours of rarely washed bodies and garments, while also signalling sophistication. A whiff of rosewater or musk could distinguish a courtier from the crowd. Taken together, shoes, feathers, gloves, paint and perfume were not trivial additions, but vital props in the ongoing performance of power. In Elizabeth's court, every inch of the body was curated, polished and staged. Fashion was total theatre, and the smallest accessory could tip the balance between favour and disgrace. No one understood the power of clothing better than Elizabeth I, while her courtiers scrambled to keep up with the shifting trends of ruffs, pearls and embroidery. The Queen set the tone for the entire kingdom. She was not simply fashionable, she was fashion itself, the living standard by which all others were judged. Every detail of her wardrobe was carefully orchestrated, transforming her body into a political canvas and her image into propaganda. Elizabeth's portraits reveal this strategy in vivid detail. She rarely appeared in anything less than overwhelming splendour. Her gowns were mountains of brocade and velvet, stiffened with gold thread and glittering with pearls. Her collars framed her head like halos, while her skirts flared outward in massive farthingales that turned her into a moving edifice. These weren't clothes meant for comfort, they were costumes of majesty, designed to dwarf, intimidate, and inspire. Pearls became her personal signature. By drowning herself in them, Elizabeth cultivated the persona of the Virgin Queen. Purity and chastity shimmered from every gown, yet the sheer volume of pearls also shouted wealth and dominance. No one else could afford such excess, and even if they could, none dared to rival her display. Her use of colour was equally symbolic. White and gold suggested purity and divinity, while black projected authority, restraint, and power. In portraits such as the Armada portrait, she appears draped in white and silver, one hand resting on a globe, her wardrobe merging personal virtue with imperial ambition. But Elizabeth's clothing was more than just theatre, it was control. She famously bestowed cast-off gowns to favoured ladies-in-waiting, a calculated move that turned clothing into a currency of favour. At the same time, she punished those who dared to imitate her too closely. Courtiers walked a fine line. Dress richly enough to honour her court, but never so splendidly as to compete with the Queen herself. Through fashion, Elizabeth projected not just beauty, but near divinity. She transformed her frail, mortal body into an immortal icon, commanding loyalty and awe through silk, jewels, and paint. When she entered a chamber, it was less a woman who arrived than a myth in motion. In the Elizabethan court, the Virgin Queen did not simply rule, she dazzled, and in dazzling, she conquered. While Elizabeth and her courtiers shimmered in gold-threaded velvets and gowns heavy with pearls, the vast majority of England's people lived in a world of wool, leather, and linen. Fashion was not a universal playground, but a wall that separated the privileged few from everyone else. Clothing became a daily reminder of hierarchy, stitched visibly into every class from peasant to noble. At the lowest levels of society, dress was purely practical. Peasants wore coarse wool in muted shades of brown, grey or green, colours that could survive dirt and hard labour. Women tied their hair beneath linen coifs, while men donned simple jerkins and hose. Shoes, if worn at all, were plain leather, built for walking fields rather than parading at court. Comfort and survival dictated their wardrobes. Luxury was an alien concept. For the rising merchant class, however, clothing became a battleground. These wealthy tradesmen and artisans had money but lacked noble blood. They longed to imitate the fashions of the elite, purchasing imported silks and elaborate doublets. Yet the sumptuary laws stood in their way, barring them from wearing certain fabrics and colours. To dress above one's station risked heavy fines. Enforcement varied, especially in London, where merchants flaunted their wealth, but the laws existed to hammer home the truth. Money alone did not equal status. Even among the gentry, competition was fierce. A country squire might spend recklessly to dress his wife in embroidered gowns, so she would not look shabby when visiting the royal court. Wardrobes became investments, symbols of ambition stitched into sleeves and collars. But these displays carried danger. Too much splendour could draw accusations of presumption, while too little could mark one as unworthy of royal favour. Thus, clothing functioned like a visual census. You could tell instantly whether someone was a labourer, a merchant, or a lord by the cut of their doublet or the fabric of their gown. Elizabethan society valued this clarity. It kept order intact, ensuring that even without words, people knew their place. In the end, Elizabethan fashion was a mirror of the kingdom itself, dazzling at the top, drab at the bottom, with countless shades in between. Each stitch told a story of privilege or poverty, ambition or obedience. For most, clothing wasn't just what you wore, it was the skin of the class system itself. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, fashion in England had become more than adornment. It was theatre, propaganda, and a cage. Every ruff, jewel, and stitch played its part in a performance that reached from the royal palace to the humblest village. Elizabethan clothing dazzled the eye, but its true purpose was to enforce order and remind everyone of their place. At court, fashion was a weapon. Nobles used it to climb higher in the Queen's favour, competing to dazzle without outshining her. Men padded their shoulders into exaggerated strength. Women cinched their bodies into rigid cones, and both sexes wrapped themselves in fabrics imported from across the globe. A single appearance at court could bankrupt a family, but without the right attire, entry into Elizabeth's orbit was impossible. Clothing determined who was visible, who was invisible, and who was powerful. For Elizabeth, dress became her crown. She turned her body into a living canvas of symbols: pearls for chastity, suns for majesty, embroidered flowers for fertility and divine right. Her portraits were less about realism than myth-making. When courtiers looked upon her in person, framed by ruffs wide as halos and skirts vast as fortresses, they saw not a woman of flesh and blood, but an icon of power. Through clothing, Elizabeth ruled not only by decree but by spectacle. Outside the palace walls, clothing remained a marker of hierarchy. The rich merchant, pushing against the boundaries of the sumptuary laws, still found himself contained by the fabrics he was permitted to wear. The peasant in coarse wool carried his place on his back as surely as the noble in velvet. Fashion was not freedom. It was surveillance, a daily reminder of who held power and who did not. And yet the beauty of Elizabethan fashion cannot be denied. The gowns, with their embroidery of gold thread and fields of pearls, the men's doublets slashed open to reveal silks of many colours, the dizzying ruffs like clouds around noble faces, All spoke of an age intoxicated by splendour. To live in Elizabeth's court was to step onto a stage where the costumes mattered as much as the lines spoken. In the end, Elizabethan fashion was never just about clothing. It was identity, hierarchy, and politics stitched into fabric. It was the theatre of power, worn daily by those who ruled, those who served, and those who aspired. Every thread, every jewel, every ruff was part of a grand performance in which the price of admission was loyalty, and the cost of error could be everything. To be pregnant in the Middle Ages was to live inside a world of constant fear and fragile hope. With little understanding of medicine, every stage of pregnancy felt like a gamble. Women and their families turned to the only guides they trusted: superstition, religion, and tradition. What a pregnant woman ate, what she saw, whom she spoke to, even the phase of the moon. All of these could supposedly determine the fate of the unborn child. Pregnancy was less a private biological event than a public drama, wrapped in rules and warnings. One of the strongest beliefs was that the mind and body of the mother directly shaped the child. If a woman looked upon something frightening, it was feared the baby might be born disfigured or monstrous. A sudden shock or upsetting sight could mark the child permanently, a superstition known as maternal impression. As a result, communities often tried to shield expectant mothers from disturbing images, loud noises, or even bad tempers, believing such influences could seep into the womb. Daily life became a careful balancing act. Foods were judged not just for nutrition, but for symbolic power. Certain fruits or meats might encourage a healthy baby, while others were believed to invite deformity or disease. Women were told to avoid eels, rabbits, or anything thought unclean, since consuming such animals risked passing their traits onto the child. Even bread and wine could be deemed dangerous if not blessed or prepared properly. The heavens themselves were thought to influence the pregnancy. A lunar eclipse was feared above all else, believed capable of causing miscarriage or birth defects. During eclipses, women were often hidden indoors with charms tied around their necks or bellies, anything to block out the moon's shadow. Astrology also played its role, with midwives and families consulting the stars to predict both the timing of birth and the character of the child. In this atmosphere, pregnancy was not simply a physical condition, but a spiritual and cosmic one. Every decision carried weight, every moment could tilt fate. For medieval women, superstition was not optional. It was a shield, however fragile, against a world they could not control. The womb, in their eyes, was as vulnerable to demons, eclipses, and curses as it was to illness. Among all the saints of the medieval imagination, none was more important to pregnant women than St. Margaret of Antioch. Her story, passed down in sermons, manuscripts, and miracle collections, read like a divine allegory for childbirth itself. According to legend, Margaret was swallowed whole by a dragon, an image that mirrored the fear of women entering the jaws of labour. Yet she emerged alive and unharmed, splitting open the beast's belly with the sign of the cross. To medieval minds, this was not only a tale of martyrdom, but a heavenly promise. If St. Margaret could survive the dragon, then mothers too could survive the perils of childbirth. For centuries, her name was invoked in the birthing chamber. Midwives carried small devotional books with prayers dedicated to her, and women often clutched charms inscribed with her image as labour pains began. Sometimes these prayers were read aloud at the bedside, transforming a terrifying moment into a ritual of divine protection. In some places, even reciting her life story during labour was thought to bring relief. It was said that simply hearing her tale could make the womb open more easily, as if her victory over the dragon echoed in the bodies of mothers who called upon her. St. Margaret's popularity was immense. Churches dedicated to her sprang up across Europe, and her feast day was observed with special reverence by women hoping for children. Noblewomen and peasants alike sought her protection, showing that fear of childbirth crossed all social boundaries. Wealthy families might commission painted icons or gilded reliquaries in her honour, while poorer women made do with tiny lead or pewter badges blessed at her shrines. The material did not matter. The faith did. Her role was more than symbolic. It was profoundly psychological. In a world where maternal mortality was terrifyingly common, belief in St. Margaret offered a sense of control. The pain, the risk of death, and the uncertainty of the outcome were framed not only as medical dangers, but as spiritual battles in which the mother did not fight alone. She fought with a saint by her side. In the medieval birthing chamber, amid candles, whispered prayers, and anxious relatives, St. Margaret's name became a lifeline. She was the dragon slayer who tamed fear itself, a reminder that even in the blood and sweat of childbirth, divine help might be only a prayer away. If prayer to the saints provided spiritual comfort, amulets offered tangible protection. In the Middle Ages, pregnant women often wore or carried objects believed to shield them from evil forces, difficult labours, or monstrous births. These amulets ranged from precious stones set in silver to humble scraps of parchment tucked into a pouch. Each carried its own reputation, and together they created a shield of charms against unseen dangers. One of the most popular materials was jet, a glossy black stone thought to repel demons and protect against miscarriage. Amber, too, was prized for its supposed power to ward off illness and evil spirits. Wealthier women might wear beads of these stones strung around the neck or sewn into their clothing, while poorer women used polished pebbles, bones, or bits of iron in hopes of achieving the same effect. Iron, especially, was believed to terrify supernatural beings. A simple iron key tied to the belt or placed beneath the bed could serve as a protective weapon against witches and fairies said to steal or curse unborn children. Written charms were equally common. Short prayers, biblical verses, or magical words were copied onto slips of parchment, folded, and worn in a small pouch around the neck or belly. Some contained the names of saints like Margaret or Mary, while others invoked Christ's wounds or obscure Latin phrases that blurred the line between religion and folk magic. To wear such a charm was to carry a piece of sacred power directly against the skin. Animal parts, too, found their place in this system of belief. The tooth of a wolf was thought to prevent premature labour, while a hare's foot, later famous as a good luck charm, was sometimes used to protect against miscarriage. Even feathers, shells, and dried herbs could be bound into amulets, each with its own meaning in the tapestry of superstition. For medieval women, these objects were more than trinkets. They were lifelines. In a world where medical knowledge was limited and childbirth was dangerous, amulets provided a sense of control, something physical to cling to when prayers alone seemed too distant. Whether blessed by a priest or whispered over by a village wise woman, amulets bridged the gap between faith and fear. To step into pregnancy without them would have felt reckless. With them, a woman could at least believe she was guarded, her body armoured not in steel, but in symbols. In the Middle Ages, what a pregnant woman ate was believed to shape not just her health, but the very body and soul of her child. Medieval medical texts, sermons, and folk sayings all carried stern warnings about forbidden foods that could twist fate within the womb. While hunger and cravings were seen as natural, indulging them too freely was thought to invite disaster. One common fear was that eating certain animals might imprint their qualities onto the unborn. Rabbits, for example, were to be avoided. Their reputation for timidity sparked the belief that a child born from a rabbit-fed mother might be weak or cowardly. Similarly, eels, slippery and serpentine, were shunned for fear they could cause deformities or illness in the child. Pork and other heavy meats were considered dangerous as well, blamed for difficult births or for producing sluggish, unhealthy infants. Fresh fruit, too, was sometimes suspect. Medieval people worried that eating unripe or sour fruit could sour the womb itself, leading to miscarriage or sickly babies. Grapes and apples might be allowed in moderation, but only if they were ripe, and often only if blessed. In contrast, certain foods were recommended for building strength. Almonds, honey, and carefully prepared grains were thought to nourish both mother and child with purity and balance. Cravings, however, carried their own risks. Medieval law held that if a pregnant woman's craving went unsatisfied, the frustration could mark the baby physically. Birthmarks, strange blemishes, or even deformities were explained as the result of denied desires. If a woman longed for strawberries and was refused, people feared the child might be born with a red stain upon the skin. Fulfilling a craving wasn't just kindness, it was preventative medicine. Husbands and families were often pressured to indulge these whims, believing that failure could scar the child for life. Fasting days imposed by the church complicated matters further. Pregnant women were sometimes exempted, but piety often dictated restraint. Breaking the fast could weigh heavily on a woman's conscience, as she worried whether her disobedience might bring harm to her child. Thus, diet became a negotiation between faith, superstition, and survival. For expectant mothers, every bite carried meaning. Food was never simply nourishment, it was moral, spiritual, and magical. To eat wisely was to guard the womb. To eat wrongly was to risk bringing forth not a healthy child, but a living warning of broken rules. For medieval people, the sky was not distant and indifferent, it was alive with forces that shaped human fate. Stars guided crops, comets heralded disaster, and for expectant mothers, the heavens could be both guardian and threat. Pregnancy was thought to be especially vulnerable to celestial influence, and none was more feared than the lunar eclipse. An eclipse, when the moon darkened or turned blood red, was believed to interfere with the fragile balance of life inside the womb. Pregnant women were warned that if they exposed themselves to its light, their children might be born disfigured, stillborn, or cursed with monstrous traits. To shield against this, families often hurried expectant mothers indoors, shuttering windows and covering mirrors so the malign glow could not touch them. Amulets, keys of iron, knives, or consecrated herbs might be tied to the woman's waist or bed as further protection. Some even urged women to carry sharp objects during eclipses, believing the blade's power could cut through the danger of celestial interference. The moon in its ordinary phases also played a role. Astrological handbooks claimed that conception and birth were safest under certain signs of the zodiac, while others predicted misfortune. A child born under Saturn's influence might be melancholic and ill-starred, while one aligned with Jupiter could be strong and fortunate. Astrologers were sometimes consulted to calculate the best times for conception or to predict the child's destiny, blending superstition with what passed for medieval science. Solar eclipses, too, carried their own dread. Though rarer, they were seen as ominous signs that threatened not just pregnancies but kingdoms. Chroniclers sometimes connected them with waves of stillbirths or maternal deaths, feeding the belief that the sun itself could curse the womb. Even ordinary stargazing came with warnings. Looking too long at the night sky, some claimed, could draw in spirits or planetary influences that unsettled the child in the womb. Expectant mothers were advised to keep their eyes lowered and their nights quiet, protecting both themselves and their unborn children from unseen cosmic powers. In a world where childbirth already carried immense risk, the heavens added another layer of fear. The stars and moon could not be controlled, but with prayers, amulets, and vigilance, families hoped to shield mothers from the sky's mysterious wrath. If celestial forces threatened pregnancies from above, witches and malevolent neighbours were believed to endanger them from much closer to home. The Middle Ages were steeped in fear of magic, and few areas of life seemed as vulnerable to curses as the delicate state of pregnancy. A whispered word, a hostile glance, or an envious thought could, people believed, doom both mother and child. The most dreaded of these dangers was the evil eye. This superstition held that envy itself carried destructive power. If a pregnant woman drew the gaze of someone jealous, whether a barren neighbour, a resentful relative, or a passing stranger, the child in her womb might wither, deform, or die. To guard against this invisible threat, women wore protective charms, rings etched with holy names, pouches filled with salt or herbs, or even pieces of iron pinned to their clothing. Some carried blessed candles or sprinkled holy water before entering public spaces, hoping to deflect ill intentions. Witches, too, were feared as active agents of harm. Folklore warned that they could steal unborn children by supernatural means, drawing life from the womb for their own dark purposes. Tales circulated of women who miscarried after quarrels with suspected witches, fueling suspicion and sometimes violence. Midwives themselves often fell under scrutiny, for their deep knowledge of herbs and birth could look uncomfortably close to sorcery in suspicious eyes. To ward off such dangers, ritual precautions were taken. Holy relics, tiny splinters of wood, fragments of saints' bones, or strips of cloth blessed at shrines, were tied around the body as spiritual armour. Psalms were recited at the bedside, especially during the vulnerable hours of labour, to drive away any lurking spirits. Some communities even hung protective objects above the doorway, horseshoes, crosses, or bunches of herbs, to keep witches from entering the birthing chamber. But not all countermeasures were sacred. Folk healers offered magical counterspells, advising women to carry wolf teeth, tie knots in red thread, or spit 3 times to repel the curse. Blending Christianity with folk tradition, these practices reflected the desperate desire for control in an unpredictable world. For medieval women, pregnancy was already a perilous journey. The fear that human malice, as much as divine judgment or cosmic influence, could twist fate made vigilance constant. Whether through relics, charms, or whispered prayers, the womb was defended as a sacred frontier, forever at risk from both the jealous and the damned. When the first pangs of labour struck, a medieval woman was ushered into a world of ritual as much as medicine. The birthing chamber was transformed into a sacred and magical space, where every word and object carried symbolic weight. Here, amid candlelight and whispered prayers, religion and superstition blended into a tapestry of hope against the very real dangers of childbirth. One of the most common rituals was the recitation of protective prayers. Psalms were chanted aloud, invoking divine mercy, while special blessings from saints, especially Saint Margaret of Antioch, were spoken over the mother. In some regions, her vita, or life story, was read aloud during labour, with the belief that, as Margaret escaped the dragon's belly, so too would the child escape the dangers of birth. Rosaries were clutched tightly, crucifixes pressed into the hands of labouring women, as if sacred touch could lend strength. Objects carried into the room were just as important as words. Holy relics, splinters of the true cross, bits of saintly cloth, or even consecrated candles, were placed near the bed. These relics were thought to repel demons and ward off death, transforming the chamber into a fortress of light. Some families even borrowed relics from local churches, returning them with offerings if the birth went safely. But superstition filled the spaces where faith alone felt uncertain. Knots, for example, were feared to tie up the womb. Midwives carefully ensured that no knots remained in the room. Laces were loosened, hair unbraided, cords untied, so nothing symbolically blocked the child's passage. Doors and windows were sometimes left ajar, not only for air, but to encourage the soul of the child to find its way out. Candles burned steadily, their flames watched closely. If they flickered or guttered, it was seen as a bad omen. Chants, charms, and folk remedies also played their part. Herbs like rue or vervain might be burned for protection, while salt was sprinkled in corners to ward off spirits. In some regions, women sipped concoctions blessed by priests or midwives, mixtures of wine, honey, or herbs, meant to ease the pain and invite divine favour. The birthing chamber, then, was never merely a medical space. It was theatre, shrine, and battlefield all at once. Mothers laboured not only with their bodies, but with the weight of prayer, ritual, and countless invisible protections. For every cry of pain, there was a whispered invocation, an urgent reminder that in the Middle Ages, no birth happened without the unseen world pressing in. Even with prayers, relics, and amulets, not every pregnancy ended with a healthy child. In the Middle Ages, when something went wrong, when a baby was born with deformities or stillborn, it was rarely seen as a matter of chance. Instead, these tragedies were read as divine signs, punishments, or supernatural warnings. The medieval world was quick to interpret unusual births as omens, and the mother often carried the blame. One of the most feared outcomes was the so-called monstrous birth. Babies born with physical deformities, conjoined twins, missing limbs, unusual markings, were described in chronicles and sermons as portents of disaster. A child with two heads might be taken as a warning of political strife or the coming of war. A baby born covered in hair could be explained as evidence of bestial cravings, perhaps the result of the mother eating forbidden meats or gazing upon animals during pregnancy. These infants were rarely seen as individuals but as messages from God or manifestations of sin. The mother's conduct was often scrutinized. If she had broken a food taboo, failed to pray, or quarreled with a neighbor, her behavior could be blamed for the child's condition. The idea of maternal impression, that a woman's thoughts and experiences imprinted directly on the unborn, meant that even her private emotions were suspect. A moment of fear, anger, or desire could, it was believed, mark the baby forever. Communities treated such births with a mix of horror and fascination. Some infants were baptized quickly, both to cleanse them of original sin and to prevent their souls from wandering unshriven. Others were displayed as cautionary tales, used by priests to warn congregations of moral decay. Rumours spread fast, and what began as a family tragedy could become a public spectacle, tied to prophecies or local scandals. But monstrous births were not always framed as punishments. At times they were seen as cosmic warnings, signs of upheaval or divine displeasure with rulers. Chroniclers eagerly recorded them alongside eclipses, famines, and comets, slotting them into a chain of omens that foretold change. For medieval people, childbirth was never just biology. It was a dialogue with heaven and hell, with every anomaly read as a message. To hold a monstrous child was to hold proof that the world itself was unstable, its order fragile, and its mysteries unfathomable. For the medieval woman, pregnancy was never just a private journey. It was a battlefield of fears, hopes, and rituals in which superstition was both shield and compass. Without modern medicine, the risks of childbirth loomed large. Maternal death was common. Infants often did not survive, and explanations for these tragedies were sought in the realms of heaven, magic, and fate. Superstition, then, was not simply ignorance, it was a survival strategy. Every stage of pregnancy came wrapped in rules. Avoid lunar eclipses. Do not tie knots. Do not gaze upon frightening things. Pray to Saint Margaret. Carry an amulet of jet or iron. Eat carefully, lest a careless meal imprint deformity upon the child. These were not random oddities, but a collective attempt to create order in a world where so much felt uncontrollable. Each belief, no matter how strange to modern eyes, gave women a sense of agency, however fragile. Superstition also created community. Birth was rarely a solitary experience. Families, neighbours, and midwives joined forces in protecting mother and child. The birthing chamber was filled with whispered prayers, protective objects, and watchful companions. Even men, though excluded from the room itself, played their part by fetching relics, commissioning charms, or standing vigil outside. The web of customs gave everyone a role in safeguarding life, turning childbirth into a collective drama rather than an isolated event. And yet, these beliefs also weighed heavily. Women bore not only the physical burden of pregnancy, but also the moral responsibility for the outcome. A miscarriage or deformity could be blamed on her cravings, her anger, her neglect of ritual. What we might call bad luck, medieval communities often saw as fault. In this way, superstition could both protect and condemn, offering comfort while demanding perfection. Still, it is important to see these practices not merely as fear-driven, but as profoundly human. They were the tools available to people navigating uncertainty. Where doctors lacked answers, faith and folklore stepped in. Amulets, prayers, and taboos were not guarantees of safety, but they gave women something to hold on to in moments of danger and pain. In the end, medieval pregnancy was lived at the intersection of biology and belief. The womb was imagined as a fragile vessel, besieged by demons, eclipses, and envy, but defended by saints, relics, and charms. Superstition was not madness. It was meaning, carved out of fear, stitched into ritual, and passed down as the wisdom of survival. In medieval Europe, childbirth was not just a private family event. It was a spiritual crisis. To bring life into the world was both miraculous and perilous, but it also left the mother marked by blood, pain, and the ever-present fear of death. The church responded with a ritual known as churching, a ceremony designed to welcome women back into religious and communal life after they had given birth. At first glance, it might appear to be a simple blessing of thanksgiving for a safe delivery. Yet beneath the surface, it carried deeper meanings of purification, control, and the uneasy status of women's bodies in the Christian imagination. For the 6 weeks following childbirth, women were often regarded as set apart. Their labouring bodies had shed blood, a substance long associated with both life and defilement. This belief, inherited partly from biblical laws in Leviticus, meant that until they underwent a formal rite, mothers were discouraged, or sometimes outright barred, from participating in sacraments, entering holy spaces, or fully resuming their role in the parish community. To many, the mother was not only physically weakened, but spiritually unclean. Churching was the answer to this tension. Typically performed about 40 days after birth, it marked the symbolic transition from exclusion to reintegration. The woman would wait at the threshold of the church, a liminal space that embodied her temporary separation. There the priest would greet her, sprinkle her with holy water, and lead her back into the nave, often with her head veiled in humility. She then received a blessing of thanksgiving at the altar, asking for renewed health, protection, and fertility. In some cases, offerings were made, candles, coins, or gifts of food, to seal the ritual with gratitude, yet even as it restored women to the community, the rite underscored suspicion. Churching implied that childbirth left behind a spiritual stain, one that required ritual cleansing before a woman could again be deemed worthy of worship alongside her neighbours. It was both honour and reminder, honour for surviving the dangerous passage of childbirth, and reminder that her body was a site of vulnerability and pollution. Thus, the churching of women reveals the paradox of medieval motherhood, celebrated as life-givers, yet simultaneously treated with caution, regulation, and ritual boundaries. It was not just a blessing, but a statement about how society viewed women, their bodies, and their place in the sacred order. The medieval ritual of churching did not emerge in isolation. Its logic reached deep into biblical tradition, especially the purification laws of the Old Testament. In the book of Leviticus, a woman who gave birth was declared ritually unclean. For a son, she was excluded from the temple for 40 days, for a daughter, 80. During this period, she was forbidden from touching holy things or entering sacred spaces until she presented herself for purification, offering a lamb or dove as sacrifice. Medieval Christians inherited this framework, blending it with their own theology to create a ceremony that echoed these ancient laws while adapting them to Christian practice. Symbolism draped every element of the churching rite. The number 40 itself carried powerful meaning. Just as Moses spent 40 days on Mount Sinai, and Christ fasted for 40 days in the wilderness, so too did the postpartum mother wait 40 days before her ritual return. It was a period of trial, liminality, and preparation for renewal. The 40-day wait emphasized that her body and spirit needed cleansing before she could rejoin the spiritual community. The most potent biblical model, however, came from the Virgin Mary. According to the Gospel of Luke, Mary herself submitted to purification 40 days after Jesus' birth, presenting him at the temple in Jerusalem. If even the Mother of God humbled herself to ritual cleansing, then ordinary women could hardly object. This story gave churching both authority and sacred precedent, though it also reinforced the idea that even holy motherhood carried ritual impurity. At its heart, churching symbolized a tension between gratitude and suspicion. The prayers spoken over the woman were framed as thanksgiving for her survival and the safe birth of her child. Yet woven into the rite was an undercurrent of purification, as if the act of giving birth left her spiritually stained. Blood, sweat, and pain, so essential to life, were interpreted as pollutants to be ritually cleansed before she was welcome again at the altar. Thus, biblical roots gave churching a double edge. On one hand, a recognition of the dangers and sacrifices of motherhood. On the other, a continuation of the ancient idea that women's bodies carried inherent spiritual risk. By grounding the ritual in Scripture, the Church ensured its authority while wrapping the messy reality of childbirth in the language of purity and divine order. While ideas about purity and symbolism gave churching its weight, the ritual itself was grounded in highly choreographed actions. The ceremony typically took place around 40 days after childbirth, though in practice the timing could vary depending on the health of the mother, the customs of the parish, and local interpretations of canon law. What mattered most was the public act of transition, from seclusion and impurity to blessing and reintegration. The rite usually began outside the church. The mother would wait at the threshold, often veiled or modestly dressed, a visible sign of her humility and temporary separation. The priest would greet her there, echoing the biblical imagery of exclusion from sacred space. Sometimes he sprinkled her with holy water, a gesture both purifying and welcoming, before leading her inside. In some accounts, she carried a lighted candle, an offering of thanksgiving and a symbol of Christ's light guiding her return. Once inside, the priest escorted her to the altar. She might kneel or prostrate herself while prayers were spoken over her. The liturgy of churching was not uniform across Europe, but it generally included psalms of thanksgiving, petitions for the health of the mother, and blessings for fertility and protection in the future. One common prayer expressed gratitude that God had delivered her from the perils of childbirth, while another asked that she might walk in newness of life. Offerings often accompanied the ritual. A woman might present a wax candle, symbolizing light and purity, or money to the church, a gift of gratitude for survival. These gifts reinforced the connection between personal blessing and communal obligation, turning the ceremony into both a private thanksgiving and a public contribution. The ceremony concluded with the priest's blessing, after which the woman was considered restored. She could once again receive the Eucharist, attend Mass, and fully participate in the spiritual and social life of her parish. For many, this was a moment of relief, even celebration. But the very structure of the ritual, meeting the mother at the door, leading her back inside, cleansing her with water, emphasized that her body had been suspect, and only the church could remove the stain. In its choreography, churching was both tender and controlling. It offered gratitude and healing, yet framed motherhood as something requiring ritual correction. Every step of the ceremony reminded the woman and her community that giving birth was not simply natural, it was dangerous, polluting, and in need of sanctification. On the surface, the ritual of churching appeared generous, even compassionate. It was framed as a blessing of thanksgiving, a way for the community to rejoice that both mother and child had survived one of life's most dangerous ordeals. In an age when maternal death was frighteningly common, the very act of returning to church was a triumph. Prayers offered thanks to God for preservation, and the congregation shared in the joy of new life. For some women, churching could feel like a moment of healing, a recognition that their suffering had meaning, and that their endurance was worth honouring. Yet woven into this blessing was a darker thread: suspicion. Churching did not only celebrate, it cleansed. The very need for such a rite implied that childbirth, with all its blood and pain, left the mother tainted. Medieval theology often associated bodily fluids with impurity, echoing biblical laws that treated women's bleeding, whether menstruation or childbirth, as contaminating. A mother who had endured labour was therefore seen not simply as exhausted, but as ritually unfit to rejoin the sacred life of the parish until purification had been pronounced. This suspicion reflected deeper cultural anxieties about women's bodies. To men of the medieval church, the female body was paradoxical, essential for sustaining life, yet unpredictable, leaky, and dangerously close to sin. Women were praised as mothers and life-givers, but their generative power was also feared, framed as something that needed careful control. Churching symbolized this tension perfectly, a ritual that simultaneously elevated motherhood as blessed and marked it as contaminating. The mother herself occupied an ambiguous space. She was at once the source of gratitude, thanked for bringing forth new life, and the focus of concern, watched closely for signs of moral or physical impurity. This ambiguity meant that churching could be interpreted very differently depending on perspective. Some women may have embraced it as a welcome moment of thanksgiving. Others may have felt the sting of being treated as unclean. Ultimately, the rite balanced celebration with regulation. It gave thanks for survival, but reminded everyone present that women's bodies, while necessary, were spiritually risky. In this way, churching revealed not just how medieval Europe honoured motherhood, but also how it kept it under suspicion, bound by ritual to ensure control over the mysteries of life and birth. Although churching was performed by priests, it was midwives, neighbours and kin who shaped the experience of mothers between childbirth and the ritual's completion. Childbirth itself was largely women's work. Midwives were the central figures of this world, trusted attendants who knew the dangers of labour firsthand and carried a blend of practical knowledge, herbal remedies, and religious rituals. Their presence lingered even after delivery, as they helped guide mothers through the 40 days of seclusion leading to churching. Midwives were often the first to remind families about the rite. They instructed mothers on when they could safely rejoin the parish and sometimes accompanied them to the church door, serving as witnesses of survival. Their involvement highlighted the liminal nature of motherhood, between body and soul, between impurity and blessing. Midwives could also prepare small charms, prayers, or blessed objects for the mother to carry during the churching ceremony, reinforcing the sense that this was as much a protective rite as it was a thanksgiving. Neighbours and family members played their part too. The period before churching was one of restricted mobility. Many believed that an unchurched woman should not cook, fetch water, or touch communal goods for fear of passing impurity to the household. As a result, neighbours sometimes provided food or assistance, ensuring that the mother's temporary exclusion did not leave her abandoned. But this generosity came with an edge. Her seclusion also reinforced social boundaries, reminding her and others that she was not yet clean. Community expectations shaped how women approached the ceremony. For some, churching was a joyful re-entry, a moment to parade their survival and the health of their child before watchful neighbours. For others, it was a moment of scrutiny. Gossip could swirl if a woman delayed her churching, or if she seemed reluctant. Such hesitation might spark whispers that she was irreligious, or worse, that she had something to hide. Thus, churching was not just a private blessing, but a communal event, binding families and neighbours into the drama of birth and renewal. Midwives offered continuity, bridging the world of the birthing chamber with the authority of the church, while the community bore witness to a mother's reintegration. In this way, churching was as much about reinforcing social order as about spiritual cleansing. Although churching was a widespread practice throughout medieval Europe, it was far from uniform. The ritual's basic structure, thanksgiving, blessing, and reintegration, was broadly shared, yet its details shifted depending on geography, local clergy, and community tradition. These regional variations reveal how flexible the rite could be, adapting to different cultural anxieties about motherhood, purity, and women's roles. In England, the ceremony often retained a strong sense of humility. Mothers arrived veiled, sometimes barefoot, and waited at the church door before being led in by the priest. Offerings of candles were especially prominent in English parishes, where women placed wax tapers at Marian shrines or before the high altar. This reinforced a link between the new mother and the Virgin Mary, creating a model of obedience and piety. In France and parts of the Low Countries, however, churching took on a more celebratory tone. There are accounts of mothers attending Mass in fine clothing, accompanied by female kin, and sometimes even treating the event as a small feast afterwards. In these communities, churching could resemble a rite of social display as much as purification. The woman was not only rejoining the parish, but reclaiming her place in its networks of honour and reputation. Germany and Central Europe emphasised protective elements. Mothers might carry sprigs of blessed herbs, such as rue or vervain, to ward off evil spirits as they entered the church. In some regions, the priest's prayers explicitly asked for protection against witches and demons, reflecting local fears that women and their newborns were especially vulnerable to malefic forces during this transitional period. In Mediterranean regions, where Marian devotion was particularly strong, churching sometimes blurred into festivals of the Virgin. Mothers brought offerings not only for Thanksgiving, but also to dedicate their children symbolically to Mary's care. This turned the rite into a bridge between the mother's private experience and the wider cult of the Virgin. Even within a single country, practice could differ from parish to parish. Wealthier communities highlighted the giving of candles and alms. Poorer ones simplified the ritual to a brief blessing at the church door. What unified them all was the core assumption. Until the ceremony was completed, the mother remained liminal, set apart from her full role in both church and community. These variations show how churching was never a fixed script, but a living tradition, moulded by local fears, devotions, and customs. Everywhere, however, the rite communicated the same message. Motherhood was sacred, but it needed supervision, ritual, and reintegration to be made safe. At its heart, churching was not just about blessing women, it was about reminding them, and everyone watching, of where authority resided. In medieval Europe, the church was an overwhelmingly male institution. Priests conducted the ceremony, bishops defined its rules, and theologians shaped the narratives that cast women's bodies as both sacred and suspect. Churching, though directed at mothers, ultimately placed them under the gaze and control of male clerical power. The choreography of the rite underscored this hierarchy. The mother waited outside the church doors until summoned by the priest, symbolically dependent on male permission to re-enter sacred space. Even as the ritual was framed as thanksgiving, the language of many prayers emphasized obedience and humility. Women were often reminded of their duty to raise children in faith, to remain modest, and to accept their place in the divine order. The priest, as mediator, stood between the mother and God, guiding her back into the fold on the church's terms. This dynamic reflected wider medieval ideas about gender. Childbirth was seen as women's primary vocation, but it was also interpreted through the lens of Eve's punishment in Genesis. In pain you shall bring forth children. Churching could thus be read as both blessing and subtle rebuke, a reminder that female suffering in labour was bound to sin and required ritual management by men. By framing the mother's return as an act of purification, the church asserted its role in regulating women's most intimate experiences. Husbands, too, played a role in reinforcing this authority. In many communities, it was customary for the husband to escort his wife to the ceremony, signalling not only her reintegration into the parish, but also her return to conjugal life. The ritual marked the moment when marital relations could resume, a reminder that the wife's body was not fully her own, but part of a broader system of family, reproduction, and social order, all overseen by male authority. Yet women were not merely passive. Some embraced churching as a moment of recognition, turning it into an opportunity for public affirmation of survival. Still, the structure left little doubt. The church defined the terms of her purity, her role, and her return. In blessing her, it also bound her more tightly to a hierarchy that placed men as guardians of both her body and her soul. Although the churching rite was framed and led by men, women themselves were not silent participants. Medieval mothers, midwives, and female kin brought their own interpretations to the ceremony, sometimes embracing it wholeheartedly, other times reshaping it to fit their needs, and occasionally pushing back against the assumptions it carried. Their voices, though faint in the written records left mostly by male clergy, can still be traced in the margins of practice and memory. For many women, churching was a welcome moment of recognition. Surviving childbirth, a trial that could so easily end in death, was worth celebrating. To stand once more in the parish, blessed before neighbours, was a public acknowledgement of endurance and resilience. Some mothers treated churching almost as a second birthday, not for the child but for themselves. The gifts of candles or alms became acts of agency, a way of marking gratitude in their own terms, even if framed by the church's ritual. But there were also quieter resistances. In some regions, women turned churching into a festive occasion, gathering friends and kin, dressing richly, and hosting meals afterward. Clerics sometimes grumbled that this transformed a solemn rite of purification into a social party. But for mothers, it was a chance to reclaim joy and assert their place in community life with dignity rather than shame. The very act of appearing proud and adorned at churching undermined the notion that childbirth had left them spiritually degraded. Women also blended official prayers with folk practices. A mother might carry a charm blessed by her midwife, alongside the candle offered at the altar, weaving together sacred and popular traditions. This layering of belief gave her a sense of control within a framework otherwise dictated by men. Some resisted more directly by delaying or avoiding churching. Records show that not all women rushed to the ritual at 40 days. A few postponed it until they felt strong, while others ignored it altogether, especially in rural areas where clerical oversight was weaker. Though this could provoke gossip or disapproval, it demonstrates that women were not universally bound by the rite's expectations. Through these actions, medieval women transformed churching into more than just purification. They turned it into a stage where survival could be honoured, where community could gather, and where female voices, though muted, found subtle ways to shape the meaning of their return. The ritual of churching lingered for centuries, surviving well beyond the Middle Ages and shaping how motherhood was understood in Christian Europe. Even after medieval fears of blood and impurity began to fade, the custom remained, embedded in parish life as both blessing and expectation. Its endurance reveals how deeply the Church's views on women, purity, and control had sunk into the fabric of society. For some, the rite was remembered as comforting. Women in later centuries often spoke of it as a joyful thanksgiving, a chance to publicly mark survival and to rejoin communal life after weeks of seclusion. In Catholic countries, churching was sometimes renamed or softened, framed as a maternal blessing rather than a purification, highlighting the gratitude rather than the suspicion. Yet the shadow of its origins never fully disappeared. The Reformation, too, wrestled with the rite. Protestant reformers criticised it as superstition, seeing echoes of Jewish law or medieval excess. Some communities abandoned it entirely, while others reshaped it into a prayer service of thanksgiving stripped of purification language. Still, in both Catholic and Protestant lands, the idea that mothers required ritual acknowledgement after birth persisted, showing how difficult it was to separate tradition from theology. The legacy of churching also speaks to the larger question of how societies balance honour and control. On the one hand, it celebrated mothers, giving them a public moment of recognition rare in a world where most women's labour went unseen. On the other hand, it bound them tightly within a system that defined their bodies as dangerous, their sexuality as suspect, and their return to community as something that required clerical permission. By the modern era, churching had largely faded, though traces survive in certain blessing rituals still performed in parts of Europe and Latin America. Today, historians look back on it not only as a curiosity of medieval ritual, but as a window into the paradox of Christian motherhood, revered as sacred, yet burdened with suspicion, celebrated for life-giving power, yet subjected to control. The churching of women was never just about mothers kneeling in church. It was about how a society understood gender, purity, and power. Its echoes remind us that rituals can both heal and bind, offering comfort while quietly reinforcing the structures of authority that define who belongs and on what terms.